Pete Williams. I direct architecture, and I'm the chief architect at a small specialty insurer called Hagerty. Somebody already asked me what kind of cars those are. I do not know. Does anyone know? Shout them out. I think somebody said at least one's a McLaren. I don't know. But Hagerty is a specialty insurer. We insure collectible vehicles, specifically not daily drivers. So if you have a vehicle that you love that was made before 1980, it's more than likely that we insure it. But also we insure supercars and all kinds of other crazy stuff. And we also have a marketplace that we try to buy and sell cars in. So I'm going to start us off with a story today. A story of when my life was changed for the better, I think. Anybody here ever been to PAX? It's a video game, board game conference. Show of hands. That guy in the back, nice, couple. So at PAX, there's a pitch your game panel. People can show up and just kind of pitch a video game that they think should be made. The panel takes it apart as much as they can in hopefully a roasting fashion. It usually devolves into a bit of punnery and just kind of who can tell the silliest joke around a video game. So somebody walked up in the middle of the session. If we get to the end, and if I have time at the end, I'll tell you what mine was in that session. But somebody else got up and they walked to the front, and they had the microphone, and they started off with, "So we all know that Microsoft Windows XP can support up to 24 concurrent USB mice." Everyone was just like, I guess we all did know that. And the guy was actually there, he's like, but what we didn't know is that we could then simulate being 3 octopuses at the same time. The game wasn't picked, unfortunately, but actually the guy ran out of the room after he kind of mic dropped and left, and it was pretty amazing. But it was the "so we all know" part that really stuck with me. Leading off any sort of sentence with "so we all know that." And I think that that is an interesting precursor to this conference, right? If we talk about like ubiquitous language and all that good stuff, it's how do we get to a place where we all know the same thing? So a little bit about me. Did I just turn off the thing? I did, okay. How about that? Okay, a little bit about me. I recently started getting into gardening. I'm a big board game player, as you can see. I first attended this conference in 2019, the last time it was here. It was transformative for me. So since getting an architecture team, I've come back, I've brought them all here. We're all reading the blue book. We haven't worked up the courage to ask Eric to sign it yet, but we're thinking about doing it before the day's over. I'm sad to report that the light switch that I installed, it was a timer switch, so the switch still works, but the timer has stopped working. I haven't figured out why that's the case yet. And I'm very proud to say that my wife is an incredible composer. I hope that you'll look at her music. And we like to joke that we are an architecture family because we both have a shared language. I happen to have lines and boxes and talking about building software. She happens to have centuries of established scores that are a shared language that are very easy to adopt by anyone who gets into reading and writing music. So how did I get here? I always thought I was going to be an engineer. I started off as an engineer, as like a very early employee at a very small services company that made a document management product. I was at that company for like 9 years. When I knew it was time to move on, I ended up at Domino's Pizza. Domino's Pizza, famous for the pizza tracker, amongst other software innovations. And in my interview, this is from recollection, I don't remember if this was the actual model, but in my interview, my mentor, who would become my boss, Jeff Nato, showed me this model and said, "What do you think about this?" And for those of you who are not familiar maybe with this syntax, right, the closed diamond is composition and the open diamond is aggregation in sort of Booch-style modeling. And so this is really his test, right? He's like, how do you think about these things? How do you think about entities? How do you think about life cycle of entities here? So in this example, like if you define a product in a catalog, that product could have, and the numbers aren't on here, but it could have product offerings. So the example here is like Coke is a product. 2-liter bottle of Coke is a product offering. 20-ounce bottle of Coke is a product offering. And when we place an order just aggregates a bunch of product offerings together that you're buying, right? So that was the discussion. And the thing that really hooked me on this idea was I asked him, hey, so how do you know when to take this model apart, right? Because we've got product offering, and order. To me, it seems like order and product, they're related, but they're not the same entity. And his response was, well, that's kind of the art of this. It's like the artistry of the creativity of drawing a model like this. And that's when I was completely hooked. So at Domino's, I joined a greenfield project about a year in progress. We built a bunch of domain sliced services. So I spent most of my time talking about products, orders, carts, inventory, recipe, fulfillment. It was great. I learned more than I think anybody in this room knows, except for my friend James Posinel, who I worked with there, about how Domino's prices its products. So, spoiler alert, the $7.99 3 topping carryout deal that now is a 1 topping carryout deal because it was actually too economically good for us, the consumers. That was the way to go. Order more pizza from Domino's, order less bread. You'll ruin their margins. Unless you're an investor, then I guess do the opposite. So how did we get actually here? How did I get to Hagerty? So Hagerty actually reached out to me while I was at Domino's, and they said, you know, we're this small specialty insurer, but we are a product-focused company, right? We want to make products. We want to make products really fast. We want to expand out of insurance. We want to get into these other lines of businesses, and the way that we can do that is by making cool technology that'll get people really engaged with it. And on top of those new products that they were doing for those new lines of businesses, they wanted to do a large-scale modernization project, which for me, I just come off of, I've been doing that for 3 years with Domino's. I was like, yes, awesome, I want to do this again. I don't want to join 1 year in. I want to be there from the start. I want to be the guy, right? I want to be the guy leading the design of this thing from the top. So we talked for 8 months, 8 months about what that would entail. And probably a lot of folks in the room have been through that type of negotiation where you're trying to set very precise terms as to like, okay, I want my job to be this, and I want it to have this outcome and this expectation. I want to learn these things, right? That's what all the time that I spent trying to set that up, and finally we got to a place where we agreed on what it was. The boundaries would be clear. The idea would be that we would do this modernization project and that the business would just buy in because we were replacing legacy code. Everyone's excited about doing that, cool. That project got canceled 6 months into my tenure. So what do we do next? Well, I'll tell you a little bit more about the past of like what we did next, but kind of what was the journey getting there. So my first day, the VP of Enterprise Architecture at this organization, was like, hey, so you want to come learn some things about what we have? And I said, sure. And he sent me a lucid chart with the label ecosystem, and it was this. And he's like, this is it. This is our whole ecosystem. This is awesome. And would anyone here believe it if I told you there are some serious issues with this that are really hard to pin down? Would you believe it also if those of you who recognize that logo in the top right, that Salesforce might have been partly to blame for some of these issues that occurred over time? The other funny thing that he asked me this first day we're going through this document is, so I heard you're going to try and start up another architecture center of excellence. Good luck with all that. I was like, really? Like what was the problem with the last one? He's just like, yeah, you'll have fun. Good luck with all that. And I was like, okay, great. So I'm confident, hired to be a change agent, thinking I'm going to go on a modernization project by myself. It's an IT budget of over $100 million. What could possibly go wrong, right? Like, what? Yeah, we'll be fine. So how did this world that we were looking at breathe, right? There's an enterprise architecture group that person was leading. They were mostly, as far as I could tell, responsible for integrations into the legacy. There was a monolith, the legacy insurance system. There were other people outside of that enterprise architecture group, also with the title architect, who reported up to engineering managers. So they were helping those teams seemingly crank out these products, and they were kind of optimizing for speed, but they were trying to make decisions as they went. And then they realized, well, actually, maybe we should stop letting kind of everybody go real fast in their own autonomous fiefdoms, and we should instead try to, have some sort of democratic process. So they're like, okay, we'll publish an RFC process, right? Everybody loves those. They'll comment on it. We'll make technical decisions, all together, and it'll be great. That process was never really effective. A lot of teams just ended up kind of doing their own thing. And so that ecosystem document right, it's easy to see how, it's easy to believe how so many of these boxes, right, they just kept popping up more and more and more and more because teams were like, yep, let's just keep adding, no problem. We'll just keep adding, turning things off. That's not interesting. We'll just keep adding. So I actually spent a bunch of time trying to learn this, right? And here's actually a deck that I shared with the executives on my progress kind of a month into the position. And I started talking about this concept in the bottom left, right? I want to have product conversations that understand the cost. I was using the word cost at the time, I don't know, impact maybe is the word I'd use now, of adding a single word. And that was my foray into trying to make them understand, right? Look, these lines and boxes, this is great. We've got an insurance offering, we got filings, we got products. This was a distillation. We'll get into what that means in a second, but I tried to set some key results around creating domain models. I tried to set some key results around creating a language that people could use. I was like, people buy into this is gonna be no problem. And as I was learning more about insurance, I was like, the complexities in insurance are largely coupled to the regulations that are placed on it. Like the software itself is actually fairly commodity. It's not terribly complex to manage states of policies and things like that. But filing things with departments of insurance and knowing what rules are allowed, that's where the complexity lies. So let's just get out there, let's build a really good insurtech system, and the beautiful architecture that we come up with, it'll be a natural network effect, they'll get into it, they'll love it, they'll wanna be a part of it. So this deck, it did okay. I think people started to understand what all the words I was using were, but how do you translate something like this into actual impact in the organization? Well, I said, okay, it's time to do some learning. So we get out there, we get a bunch of subject matter experts in the room, right? We get the current architects on the enterprise architecture team. We get the business subject matter experts who are willing to hang out with me. We get the product manager that the person who hired me had hired 6 months prior, so he had 6 months ahead of me of trying to figure out what we were gonna do. Got them all into the room, started drawing. It's not that complicated, right? Again, I figured out like the program version and insurance offering in the middle. That made sense. It would associate to an insurance product. It would associate to an insurance program. Those programs and those products, were associated by a filing, right? All of this makes sense. So when you zoom out, right, you start to understand that, okay, then the product's more complicated and the filing happens on the bottom, and it seems like on the right, actually, the policy is an instance of this. And it's like, really, like, if we just keep zooming out, like, I'm sure we can all come to a shared understanding of how this thing actually works. I mean, if we really focus very heavily on, right, you can see where this goes. We've all done this. We've all drawn spaghetti that looks like this. How do you distill this? How do you turn this into something that people can understand? How do you make this valuable? How do you use this, or even distilled, to convince people that, yep, we should go spend X million dollars on a modernization journey with something like this? How hard could it be? I did find one, here was my first hill that I think I didn't die on, because I'm still here. But here was the first idea, right? I noticed when I was talking to people that in an insurance policy, which has a bunch of coverages attached to it, those coverages had two types, endorsements and what I just colloquially called normal coverage at the time. Endorsement, just a specific type of what insurance experts might call a rider or something like that, whereas like a coverage might be something like collision or comprehensive that we're more used to. And I noticed also that people, the subject matter experts, also use this word endorsement to refer to any time a policy changed. So you can see where this overload immediately causes this disconnection, this discrepancy. So I was like, great, I found this. This is cool. What do y'all think about changing this in the new system? You can never do anything. Like, how on earth can we change the definition of the word endorsement, right? My favorite part of this story is literally, I'd just gotten to know a team that was shipping a policy API, and they declared one of their entities to be /endo. And they're like, you just spent a month, 2 months talking to us about how bad breaking changes are, and you want us to get rid of this entity? Like, just not good. And then beneath that, right, monolithic application, the policy management system is storing endo as a first-class DB entity. We're going to go into our monolithic application, change our database tables? That's crazy. We don't do that. Operations came back to me and said, I understand what you're saying. However, we've got, at that point, 1,000. Now it's probably closer to 2,000 people in our service center, and they use this word to talk to each other about this exact process. How can we change its definition? That's wild. And finally, who was supposedly my ally, the product owner, that product manager was with me 6 months ahead, had all that information. He's like, this is getting out of hand. Like, can you stop drawing lines and boxes? Can we just go make some software, please? Like let's take an iterative approach. Come on. I said, what we're lacking here is shared understanding. Obviously, we need to do some big picture event storming. So we got everybody in the room, right? And we said, okay, all those people I just talked to, teach me insurance's life cycle. And I'm pretty sure anyone who has worked with Paul Rayner knows that you are obligated to use that font at the top, the Bangers font in Miro. That's the hallmark. So this was like our big picture, right? We ended up with something that looked like this. We distilled it further into these sort of sub-parts of the insurance policy lifecycle. Quote application moves into policy, things like that. And I said, you guys helped me build it, right? I got 20 people in a room, people who've been in the company for decades, explaining to me how this stuff works, what makes it special. I'm like, great, I learned all this, this is incredible. And then they just don't care about it, right? It's like there's no shared, even though we built it together, there's no shared ownership. We got a lot of learning on the page, and there were some aha moments that you see with event storming, like where people say, well, I didn't know you were doing this over here, and we can improve process efficiency, but how do you translate this into software? So this didn't really land quite that well. So I started thinking about the why. Right? Why are we doing this? Why are we doing in architecture? Right? I learned about insurance, but I wasn't getting buy-in. Why didn't they feel shared ownership? Why won't they keep coming to these, what's the word, captive audience meetings where they have to stay in the room with me and do lines and boxes? So I thought about, like, why are we doing architecture? A startup doesn't really hire architects. They usually hire a VP of engineering or a first employee, right? That person gets the code out as fast as possible, proves the concept, finds market traction. So why are we doing architecture? This second bullet point changed my life also the last time I was at Domain-Driven Design Con. Somebody said this in a talk about code, where they said, if you can guarantee the code never changes, it doesn't matter what it looks like. I was like, yeah, that's true. If you only ever have to solve the problem once, who cares, right? The quality is not a measurement, it's just a measurement of is the problem solved. So great, do it once. And then I've heard a lot of people in this conference so far talk about tech debt, which I really think is great. They've talked about it as a tool, right? And so I feel like if I agree with a lot of the speakers I've heard talk about this, if you choose to take it on actively, you might not need an architectural point of view to be successful because maybe you're never going to pay it back, right? Just, sure, we'll take this on and it'll be good enough for now. One last thing that I'll mention here in my notes is that the other thing that we're up against is business folks. They love to think that once a tech project is done, that they're done paying for it, right? We shipped it, it's over. One-time capital expense, no problem. What's maintenance, what's change? We would never want to do that. So actually, they like option 2. Write it once and never change it. Just guarantee that, that would be great, thank you. So fast forward to the present. So that was kind of the space I got in, first 6 months of my tenure. Make a really long story short, the person who hired me was fired. Before that person was fired, I convinced him to hire a very close friend of mine, a guy named Chad LaJoy. He came in, was installed as my boss, so now my boss is my friend. The previous exec was let go, and the previous enterprise vice president retired, enterprise architecture vice president retired. So when my friend Chad was then promoted to VP of engineering, he made a decision to coalesce the architecture, all those different architects that were kind of around under me. So I was like, okay, this is great, it's showtime. I'm no longer a single change agent pushing against the inevitable tides. Right now I'm gonna have a squad. What are we gonna do? So actually my team is here, so this is a meeting within a meeting, right? We're gonna do a quick presentation, my architecture team. Guys, this is what we would be talking about today if we were actually meeting. We'd be talking about our OKR scorecards and all that, but the reason I put up this silly slide is really for this slide. It's embarrassing that Thomas introduced me, but I'm really happy to meet him. I show this slide every Friday to my team. This is the slide that sets us up for success, right? Architecture is a communication practice, it's long-term thinking. My favorite thing on this slide is that architecture is an entrepreneurial practice, and if you're any sort of good entrepreneur, you know that your goal is to eventually delete yourself from the organization, right? You want the organization to grow and be able to exist without you. Philosophically, I feel very similarly about architecture in that, as we've heard from others, anyone can make an architectural decision. So we want to make an architecturally mature organization around this idea. This collection of stickies at the bottom is sort of the spectrum that I think of when I think of architecture, and these stickies are individual. Some of them are kind of artifacts, some of them are kind of concepts, and we'll talk more about this later in the presentation. But I hope that none of you feel like they're too controversial. But with respect to the outward-facing and inward-facing, we've started conceiving of these two flavors of architecture, where on the left side you have things like API governance, context mapping, representing an outward-facing view. So constituents and stakeholders come in and they want to be able to look at what we have. They want to be able to understand what it's capable of. On the right side, you have the inward-facing view, the sort of focused on the engineering audience, right? How are we going to implement this thing? What is it capable of doing? What sort of illities, product quality attributes do we need to enforce in it, et cetera? So we're thinking about architecture as a spectrum. How do we, what we're going to talk about later is how do we align roles to this? But Let's talk a little bit more about what is architecture, right? So to me, it's decisions, and those decisions are composed of two elements. How do contexts interact with each other? And how will this decision impact our future decisions, right? Are we boxing ourselves in a corner? When the business changes its mind about how it wants to operate, or when it adds new businesses, are we gonna have to issue breaking changes, or are we leaving ourselves room, right? In literal API representation, this starts to look like something like, am I gonna declare a map, or am I gonna declare a value object, or am I gonna declare a collection of value objects? And even though my first implementation only has one object in that collection, I know that there will be more in that collection later. So I don't have to issue a breaking change, I'll just make it a collection now, and I'll wait and see if that case comes up. It's sort of small decisions like that. But what the team talks about the most are the trade-offs, right? What trade-offs are we making today? We've made this decision for these reasons, here are our constraints, and most importantly, in the future, if the constraints change, here's our floor. We can start with the decision that we already made, and then we can reevaluate. I really liked one of the talks I heard yesterday that talked about superseding, I think Thomas might have been here talking about ADR superseding, right? Like that's the idea of, we can make this decision now, but what will change in the future that would change our minds, right? And it's okay to change our minds. We do it all the time. So we turned from one guy fighting against the tides to a team of people trying to create lines and boxes basically in a meaningful way, and basically running around saying it depends, and it depends on what all the time. And I'm pretty sure this conference, I really like the t-shirt this year, but here's another viable option. Paul's not in the room, but I'll share it with him later. So going back to what I said earlier about like, why are we even doing this, right? Who needs architecture? Why would a company want to go slow when that company's been optimized to be going fast for its entire 10 years so far? Basically, we have to emphasize quality, and this maxim in the middle here is our guiding philosophy behind this, right? If the software is good, it will run far longer than it takes for us to build it. So what's another insert time span here amongst friends, spending the time designing the software ahead of time so that it's implemented in, the Evans term would be like it's supple enough, right? It's supple enough that it can evolve over time. We use this to sort of influence our decisions all the time, and we fight against anyone who would challenge us in terms of speed because we're emphasizing for quality. And the other thing that I've been challenged to do by my CIO is how do we measure the value of our technology assets? So I think architecture is poised to answer this question, right? We should be able to explain what our capabilities are. We should be able to explain how those things can evolve in those contexts. And it should potentially have inherent value beyond just the ability to run the business. If you're going to be, like us, a small to mid-sized insurer that's willing to spend this amount of money on having a dedicated IT department, right? If you don't care about this, then go out and buy the software. Buy it or buy someone to build it for you, right? And don't care. Like, you're not a software development company, but we have a bunch of talented people, so let's build assets that have inherent value beyond just what the business is asking us for. So here's what needed to change. The impact of the architecture organization it's not trivial to measure, right? We're a specialized practice, if anything, on top of engineering execution. So how do we measure impact? The other thing was that with all the architects in all the different places, we had the enterprise architect team, we had architects on engineering teams, we had architects doing all kinds of things. Nobody knew what we did, right? Like what are the artifacts that we output? Why are we even, what can we ask those guys to do? How can they help us other than, there have been a couple times in my tenure where someone comes to me and says, hey, I have no idea how to, what was the example? In the state of Arizona, I have no idea how to evaluate an insurance score for a specific vehicle. And I'm like, first of all, thank you for asking me this question. It helps me understand like what you're going through. However, I can't solve this problem with software. I need you to tell me how the business would evaluate an insurance score in the state of Arizona for this thing, right? So we needed to be able to tell people what they could rely on us for. And we wanted to give our CIO, our new CIO, because the person who was let go was replaced by a new CIO at this point in the story about a year prior to me having this team, we needed to tell him what we had. Because he inherited ecosystem, as you saw before. So he didn't look at it, or he didn't dig into it deep enough to understand what it was, and I don't blame him. It's crazy. So we proposed a solution, or I proposed a solution. I said, okay, let's have clear role definitions. I'm going to take all my team members. I'm going to figure out kind of what they want to do, like looking at that spectrum, right? How do we align them to different parts of that spectrum? What are they going to produce? Our definitions of work output that align to each role, we're going to set those standardly so that people know what to expect of us when they come and ask us for work. we're going to figure out our intake so that we can measure our capacity. Nobody really understood how burdened any individual architect was at a time. And actually, I only heard this recently. One of my seniors was like, yeah, so before, it felt like everything came to me because I was the guy who got it all done. And I didn't like that because I was doing a lot. And I get it, man. Let's figure out how we can measure this and change that. And finally, probably some of you are familiar with this, companies that are really ambitious have a lot of initiatives, and all those initiatives are owned by a different executive stakeholder, and all those executive stakeholders have their own reasons for why they want this to happen. So of the 25 initiatives that we had, how on earth do we know which ones to work on? Like, please, I need this. So enter my partner in crime, my favorite ally in the organization, this woman, her name is Katie Soul. She is our director of Agile Portfolio Operations, and she came up with this portfolio life cycle. Actually, it's a few more stages than this, but these are the parts of sort of engineering has the most influence on. And she came up with a solution to that last bullet point on the last slide and saying, okay, we're going to create a portfolio, we're going to manage our portfolio, we're going to govern it in this way, and it's a commitment in two directions, right? We're committing to the business, we're going to deliver value in this force-ranked order, and the business is going to respect that we have a capacity and what we report to them is true. Basically, the way I think about this is, and I tell my guys this all the time, if you have 10 priorities and you are able to deliver 7 of them at the cost of 8, 9, and 10, you are functionally correct. No one can argue with you, right? And we have this shared source of truth to validate that exact story. So we worked together on this, and I said, I need your help, Katie. How can we inject architecture into this portfolio governance that you're building? I said, I need you to help me, and she and I came up with, I did it again, sorry. I can help her by involving our team in some of these specific steps that she's changing in the way how IT works. So we came up with 3 initial ways we could get involved. In the assessment phase, we could start creating what we call low-fidelity solutions. The goal of this is to basically figure out who all is going to be involved, what's the technical feasibility, how hard is it going to be, get some estimates on the table, right? Start to figure out like where are we going to place this thing. And one of the biggest things about this, we call it funded discovery, is we convince the business they got to pay for this, right? They can't just come with the IT shop PDF and throw it over the fence and say, come on, guys, figure this out. No, we say, give us $40,000 and about 40 hours of architect time, and we'll give you, my analogy is, a 1,000-piece puzzle with the edges already done. And the inside, we can do that later. We can do that in planning when you tell me, oh yeah, good point. This is not worth it. Or yes, the juice is worth the squeeze. This is going to cost us $500,000 to do this in 6 months, and it's going to generate $3 million in revenue over the next 3 years. Slam dunk, let's do it. Planning is when we take those low-fidelity solutions that make it through assessment, and we create what we call high-fidelity solutions, and we'll talk about some of these artifacts. We call it the solution summary, the thing that brings it all together, but we're doing a bunch of API specification, context maps, sequence diagrams, all that good stuff that are architecturally explain what we're doing. And then finally, in the execution phase, we will engage and start creating common frameworks and libraries to solve our common implementations. If we can standardize what we're doing is we're moving to standardizing on .NET technology, and we'll start creating things like libraries that process flat files and do things like SFTP, file movement between contexts, things like that. And that way, a team that needs to process and move flat files around, they don't have to solve that problem more than once. So these are the places where we're like, we can have architectural impact, yes. So I have a partner in crime, or as I actually say, Katie is my partner in vigilanteism, because a lot of the time, people try to commit crimes against the portfolio. They try to shift the force ranks around or convince us that what we're seeing is wrong. And we have a channel called actually no, well, it used to be called Crime Stoppers. Now it's called the Tiger Moat, because we heard about there are people like tigers going around trying to mess with our portfolio. So we stop them, we work together, we govern the portfolio together. Her team of what she calls Agile program managers, we have a shared Slack space with the architecture team, and we're constantly talking about, okay, who's doing what, when is it going to land, what's initiative coming in, what are we going to work on, who's got capacity for what. It's a really great collaboration. So, going back to this, I defined 2 roles, solution architect, application architect. And we align them to this spectrum. Solution architect focuses on the outward facing, application architects focus on the inward facing implementation. My favorite thing when I was solution architect is say, that's an implementation detail. I don't know, you guys figure that out. Now we're going to have application architects figure it out, which is even better. I think my solution architects probably like that. Funded discovery, did I have a note here? Nope, I'm just going to move on. So here's my definition of solution architecture, right? It's the design of integrations and interfaces between bounded contexts, including the organization movement of data. That last sort of clause there specifically is in reference to the idea that there's a lot of different ways to move data between domain boundaries, right? We all know, we're all probably familiar with things like message queues and buses and different implementation technologies of those concepts. So we focus very heavily on not only defining our entities and what the APIs look like, but how the data moves in and out of those contexts. So here's what we do. We spend a lot of time designing APIs, like a lot of time. Like these guys are cranking out incredible designs and artifacts. We'll talk about what those look like. They're basically open API specifications. We, like I said, funded discovery, we're placing capabilities. We're looking at our constellation and figuring out where this thing belongs. We map that constellation that I mentioned of software products. So this looks like context mapping. This looks like relationships between contexts, right? Paul said that Eric was giving away some of his orange books today, the little like appendix. That was something that I really appreciated the first time that I read it too. It talked about those natures of relationships. Vaughn had it in his slide this morning actually with the upstream, downstream context. We try to identify those too. And we see ourselves as a conduit between business and engineering. So we're not the only conduit. The flaw here is don't be an hourglass like a fulcrum, right? There has to be free-flowing communication between these teams, the Agile Manifesto stuff. But people know to come to us. They know that we're subject matter experts not only in what the capabilities are in this space, but also what the current implemented code is actually capable of doing and how is it going to evolve. The other side, application architecture. So the design of consistent, performant, and secure software implementations. And the last part here is what I was talking about before. How do we turn it off? Or when do we turn it off? Or is it able to be turned off, depending on how we implemented it, right? Because in theory, the software is in production until it's turned off. And again, if I'm convincing a business stakeholder, hey, if you want to add a button to a website, that is something that we're going to have to maintain in perpetuity until you tell us to get rid of it or you do something else or we change the website, right? So we need to be able to decommission this stuff. And application architecture is about the consistency of the implementation and making it capable of evolving. So we spent a lot of time choosing technology. Like I said, we're moving towards standardizing our API development on .NET technologies, but there's a whole NuGet ecosystem within that space, right? So there's all kinds of pieces of code that have been written out there that are open source and whatnot that have solved, and we evaluate those ecosystems for size, level of support, development cycles for new releases, things like that. We spend a lot of time with how data, as application architects, how data should be persisted. Relational databases, no SQL, flat file in an S3 store, I don't know, like what's the SLA on this particular thing that necessitates in a particular implementation. We use the word rigor for our NFRs and product quality attributes. So that's just all your ILIDs and stuff, right? We have observability initiatives and things like that. And then finally, we want to build our own frameworks on top of .NET, right? We want to do things like, if you want to build a new API service because the solution architecture team identified a new domain, we want to give you just the easy of creating that boilerplate nice and simple. One thing on here that I want to point out is the data persisting point. And this might be controversial, but our opinion is that there's no need to couple an API's resource representation to how that data is persisted. And the reason we believe that is because when we define our entities as a solution architecture team, we only care about how those entities get represented as a resource over the wire or representation over the wire, and we implement content negotiation to have flexibility here. However, when the team is implementing and storing this information, they can figure out what the appropriate persistence solution is regardless of how the resource is structured. Now this is an offense throw, right? The solution architect team, the application architect team will work together to figure out, okay, is the design of the API resource feasible for the persistent solution that we have access to or that we want to use or that we're already using, right? That feasibility conversation happens, but we believe that this should be decoupled. All right, so how do we deploy this? We figured it out. We started talking about what we call kind of product suites and products. So everyone here we all kind of know what the word, as we all know, the word domain means blah, 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 blah. But in my organization, the word domain is actually kind of overloaded. So we just kind of call them product suites and products. But our solution architects each own one of these far right boxes. And our application architects own the technology ecosystem that 2 or 3 of those products might implement. So if you were to pretend that all of these boxes on the far right here were .NET implementations of these products, then you might have 3 or so application architects, and then our solution architects cover 1, 2, 3, and that's also variable. So it might be like something a split like 5 or 6 solution architects and 2 or 3 application architects, right? Something like this. And these are not the only 2 product suites that exist at Hagerty. These are the only 2 that we're currently covering. There are about 5 or 6 others, and as I'll talk about if I have time at the end of the presentation, we're demonstrating how much impact we're having on these product suites, and we expect that we might start influencing the other ones soon as well. So let's talk about artifacts. I like to think about artifacts as the things that we can get wrong and the things that we can't get wrong. And all of the artifacts we can get wrong. We can get them wrong as many times as we need to until we get them right. The thing that makes us get them wrong very typically is either we didn't understand the business, so we want to make sure that we understand operating models or flows, or we make sequence diagrams, right, to represent our understanding. And like you said, or like I said at the top of the presentation, like we want to make sure that we're building that shared understanding together. But obviously we'll get that wrong sometimes, and we'll have to keep iterating on these other artifacts as many times as we need to, up to and including the implementation of the software, which can be wrong. And that's how we take an iterative approach and figure it out. Excuse me. One thing about this that we'll talk about here is architecture as code is our approach to these things that we can get wrong. And it sort of looks something like this. And it's very similar to what Thomas talked about yesterday in his talk with ADRs and other things getting put into Git repositories. So we believe that not only should we be writing ADRs, but we should be writing our open API specifications, we should be writing our context maps into a Git code base. This gives us the ability to do easy, we're taking advantage of Git here, right? So version control, review, et cetera. And then imagine all these code bases on this diagram, right? Those exist n times y, where n is the set of the products that you saw on the previous slide, and y might be the number of different services that each of those product domains have. Like, these are numerous. And one of the questions I asked Thomas yesterday when we were talking is, okay, but what about centralization? So one of the things that we're working towards is this architectural portal idea, where we take all these disparate code bases, centralize this information in one place, and take ownership of the content authoring of that location. But all of the sources of truth exist in the repositories. That's the most important part. So whether or not you want to be a consumer of this architecture portal, if you're a developer, you have the code base, right? You're pulling it down, so you already have everything that you need. But if you're, and you can obviously go read the portal, but if you're a stakeholder that doesn't understand how to do a Git clone, then go to the portal. You can read all this information, and then on top of that, what we hope to ship later is higher order architectural decisions beyond just an individual code base. So I'll quickly run through some of these artifacts here. For context mapping, for those of you who are not familiar with, go read C4 with Simon Brown, thank you. Simon Brown's talk about C4 modeling and the structurizer code. We actually have deployed an instance of structurizer into our AWS environment. We use that to render these diagrams in this slide here, right? So we have a CDN almost of diagrams that get automatically re-rendered whenever anyone checks in a new thing into a Git code base. It looks like this. For those of you not familiar, right, it's got its own domain-specific language, and it renders like that on the right side. And the little drop-down at the top there is actually, this is multiple documents. So what you're looking at right now is the C2, which includes the decomposition of one of our particular modules on the left and its interactions with other contexts on the right. And we have a lot of these. OpenAPI, for those of you not familiar with this, right, you're probably familiar with Swagger or Postman. Like, those are tools that can utilize this sort of thing. We just write the OAS in YAML. We design our APIs using YAML, and we publish it into the Git repositories, and it looks like this, and it's essentially our documentation engine. Now, one thing that's really important about this, a lot of teams like to develop their APIs and then use some sort of tool to generate their OAS post hoc. And my challenge to teams who do that is, how do you know that the code is doing what it was designed to do if the code is the source of truth, but you're looking at the OpenAPI specification? Instead, we believe the OpenAPI specification is the source of truth, and the code should be built to match it. And when there's a bug, we can look at the specification and say, right, like, is this what we designed, or is this not working as intended? So we have files that look like this. They're very large. They're very numerous. We use a CLI package to bundle them back up before we ship them off to Swagger to render it on our portal. We're doing sequence diagrams in UML. So this is another thing. Actually, this is something we only started doing in the past month because we've found that sequence diagrams are wildly helpful to all sorts of stakeholders, that technical or non. They actually can kind of understand them, not terribly difficult. And so this one's very complicated. There's a lot of different swim lanes here for a lot of different cross contexts, but it has helped us have conversations with large audiences. Particularly, we're in the middle of working with a number of solution integrators, and this is our language, and they actually can understand it, and it makes us easier to work with them. And then, as I mentioned, finally, right, we're building. So those are all solution architecture artifacts. Our application architecture artifacts are not as mature, but basically like this. They are libraries and frameworks. Functionally, a library is something you call into, and it does a work for you. A framework is something you adopt and mold to make your own. Our current framework that we've deployed is an HTTP API framework. So you define a new domain, you spin up a new service, you pull this thing in, boom, you've got boilerplate for all your API endpoints, and you're off to the races, is the idea. So here are the outcome differences that we've noticed since we've been doing this work for about 5 or 6 months. We've been seeing impact. Again, architecture is hard to measure, but we have a few things that we've keyed into that we're able to measure, which are basically teams that don't have solution architecture coverage are doing research spikes, tickets, and ADO like crazy. Teams that have solution architecture coverage are not doing them hardly at all. And if you assume that a research spike is basically not code being written, right? It's operational expense for your organization to figure out what code to write. The story tells itself, right? Get solution architecture involved. It's able to make speed to code faster. What's the metric system? DORA? Is that what it is? DORA metrics, right? Speed to code availability, right? This is our version of that. We're trying to figure out how we can measure architectural impact in that space. So with that, I'll finish up the talk kind of with a few things that we're looking to in the future. We spiked our maturity, right? We're trying to figure out our architectural maturity of the organization. We feel like we've spiked it in a few specific ways. We're working on that portal that I mentioned. It's not quite operational yet, but once we have it, then not only will we be pulling in all the ADRs and other artifacts from the repositories, we'll then be adding in our own enterprise-wide ADRs is kind of what we're calling them, and we call that the architecture of the enterprise. We're not going back to a space where we have dedicated enterprise architect title. Instead, the architecture team represents the enterprise's architectural decision-making capacity. And we invite other stakeholders and other technical people into that community, right? Because we're okay with having help. We do have to figure out what it looks like rather than just throwing an RFC process out there and hoping that everybody reads them. One of the things that we have not figured out yet, actually, is we want to get into maturity modeling, and I've still been doing a little bit of research on this, but basically, I want to put radar charts on my architectural portal, and I want to articulate the path to maturity, because if I can say context mapping level 3 results in 60% less, I'm just going to use my example from before, 60% less research spikes, right? Wouldn't it then make sense for a team to invest the time in adding this information? Now, context maps, I mentioned the architecture team's building this, but ultimately, I want any team to be able to build these types of artifacts. The problem is we haven't figured out quite how to measure these things very well. So like this is my made-up example of context mapping maturity 1 through 4. And we haven't figured out the dimensions, right? So this example of the Beatles and their musical talent, we really only have a couple dimensions defined that we can actually make meaningful measurements on. But we're working through this as a team. It's very hard. If you have any thoughts or comments, I really would welcome them. We love domain modeling. I love domain modeling. It changed my life. I have no idea how to incorporate domain modeling into the canonical sources of truth that I just mentioned to you, right? How do I do this as code? How do I get people to look at it? This drawing is really helpful. This is our thinking on payments, right? This is how we do payments, but we don't know how to, other than the other artifacts that I mentioned, we create those based on this model, and George Box said that only some of them are useful, so this is only as useful as it can be. But I haven't figured out how to incorporate this, right? It's a sketch. And since everyone else has been talking about LLMs, I'll talk about it with my last freaking slide here. LLMs, basically, our thinking is if we standardize all this architecture output, we feed it into some sort of model and train it with that plus all of our code, it could enable us to do things like boilerplate our architectural artifacts whenever somebody comes to ask a question about a capability, or even better, I mentioned that funded discovery costs money. What if an executive didn't have to spend that money and instead could prompt some sort of a GPT-like engine to say, hey, is it feasible for us to do X, Y, Z? That would be really neat. And I have to convince them that they should, instead of spending fixed amounts on funded discovery, what would it look like to invest in this? But we have a very talented data science team, and they're going to probably do something in this space, and we'll be happy to feed them. They're working on things like data marts and other ways that they can interact with the engineering department. So that's it. This is my talk. We are hiring both of these positions. If anything that I talked about resonates with you, please, these QR codes go directly to the applications on our Workday site, and I would love to talk with anyone who's interested in this. And this is also a very embarrassing time to realize that after I went to DDD 2019, I changed my LinkedIn profile to Pete Williams' DDD at the end, which is sort of like wearing the band t-shirt to the band conference. But I think, like, that's where you can find me on LinkedIn. So thank you very much.